Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. We'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
We are very excited to welcome Goldy Hyder to the Venture for Canada podcast today. How are you doing this morning, Goldy?
Doing well under the circumstances. A bit of a hoarse throat, but so bear with me.
Thanks for coming on, despite not necessarily feeling perfectly kind of healthy today. So we appreciate you taking the time to join the podcast. One issue that we're really interested at in Venture for Canada is the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, Canadian productivity has consistently declined vis-a-vis the United States. To put it in perspective, today, Canadians make around 54,000 Canadian per person versus the typical American makes around 67,000 Canadian per person. So in essence, the average American makes around 25% more than the average Canadian. Goldy, while this is a very complex issue, what do you think are some of the main drivers about why Canadian per capita income consistently is falling behind the United States?
There's so many tentacles to answer this question, but let me start at a very high level. Culture, as Canadians, we've got to really stop settling for average. We've got to, and we've got to stop punishing the successful. If you want to see Canadian economy grow and rise, it's going to require us to scale. In a way in which we don't normally scale. We have this curse in Canada, right? I mean, the great ambition seems to be to build a company, get to 10 million and sell it off and go buy a cottage in, Muskoka or Canmore or something like that, right? That's not good enough. In order to compete, we're going to need to be determined to see, unicorns in Canada. We're doing better. There's no question we're on the better track here, but we need to be more ambitious about the way in which we grow our companies. And I think that's a cultural issue. I think we have to stop settling for mediocrity and stop settling for average and just kind of, go along to get along. We have got to be aggressively ambitious. And the reason for that is so much has changed around us. My members, I represent about 170 or so CEOs of Canada's largest corporations, probably about half the Toronto Stock Exchange and market cap, a couple of million employees. So I got a good line of sight as to what's taking place here. And, you start to realize how much they're affected by geopolitics now. America is no longer the America that we grew up with. So, we won the lottery of geography. It can be a blessing, but it can also be a curse because it's made us complacent. And so we're seeing in America that's no longer about, hey, we're here for Canada, we're going to help Canada. Like they're on their own. I mean, it's America first. Not that any country has, no one has a Canada second policy. I understand that. But the policies that they're putting in place are protectionism, and is oblivious to some extent of the way supply chains work, of the way trade works, of the agreements that they made and stuff. We see what's going on in Asia. I mean, Larry Summers, down in the United States called COVID a hinge of history. The idea that there's a hinge moment that we're going to look back and say that this is when Asia really took off. And this is when, to some extent, the West fell behind. I find that very interesting as to what's taking place. What it suggests is that policy matters. That when you're voting, asking questions about things beyond the potholes and the issues that are very local to you, it does matter what our foreign policy is. It does matter what our trade policy is. It does matter what our immigration policy is. It does matter what our foreign investment policy is. These are examples of pillars of the Canadian economy. So if you get them wrong, you will have consequence for that. And what we need to do as political people and as business leaders is to communicate to Canadians, why should they care? It requires policy choices, and it requires a strategy, it requires a vision, it requires ambition, it requires urgency. Most importantly, I think it requires partnership with business, government, labor, academia, and others to say, what do we want to be when we grow up?
In terms of kind of specific policies, one stat to kind of pull up is that in 2016, Canada, only 1.7% of Canada's gross domestic product went to research and development. And that compares to 2.8% for the United States and a 2.3% average for the group of club basically of rich countries, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Nations. What specifically do you think should be done to increase the share of Canada's GDP that goes to research and development? And in particular, to kind of speak about is the importance of incenting large Canadian companies to invest more in R&D, to invest more in innovation, ultimately to drive Canada's economic growth.
I think the partnership piece is very important because I think it requires an opportunity to have a dialogue and to understand what each is trying to do. We have to trust each other. We have to trust each other, right? And I think Canadians are demanding that business leaders and political leaders and others solve their problems for them, right? I mean, you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, year after year after year, CEOs continue to outrank, political leaders, media leaders, and others. Now, I keep reminding my colleagues, we're not Supreme Court justices yet. We still have a long ways to go, but we're heading in the right direction. And so asserting our leadership as business leaders, not in the interest of our corporations or our companies, we do that every day, we're paid to do that, but in the national interest, in the interest of the well-being of Canada in a complicated world, in the interests of our, their children and their grandchildren, I think you're seeing Canadian business leaders insert themselves as leaders today on issues beyond some of these things that are just economic. And the best example of that is the pandemic, right? And you look at the pandemic, a number of things were revealed in the pandemic. First of all, we've entered an era of big government, right? I mean, people have seen that when there's a crisis, their government can actually function and can be there for them. It's not pretty, it's messy, it's complicated, right? Programs don't work seamlessly, but to their full credit, our governments did what they had to do to prevent, a rise in homelessness or, anarchy in the streets or people wondering where their next meal is coming from or people being thrown out of their homes or their rental properties, right? That didn't happen in Canada for the large part, right? People were compensated, reimbursed, kept whole in some way, shape, or in some cases made more than they even made before. I'm not going to hold that against them. Our governments responded to a crisis and did that. So people got to see that government can actually function. It can be a force for good if they put their mind to it, right? But why does it take a crisis? Why does everything have to be Rome on fire, right? So that's the first lesson. The second one I would say, and this one pains me to say, but I saw, and many Canadians saw, frankly, the dysfunctional nature of our federation. It was me, myself, and I. It was everybody for themselves. Every public health official got to do whatever they wanted to do. Every premier got to do whatever they wanted to do. Every mayor got to do whatever they wanted to do. And we as Canadians paid the price. I keep reminding people, there is only one Canadian. I am not a federal Canadian. I am not a provincial Canadian. I am not a municipal Canadian. I'm Canadian. And I think we all have left this situation wanting for how our system performed. And I believe there is an absolute necessity to ensure that there's a full autopsy done or a full retrospective done on what we got right and what we got wrong, where we can do better. Canadians deserve that because there is going to be another crisis. Don't know what it is, don't know when it's going to be, but history shows there will be another one.
And that I think most Canadians are often unaware of the fact that, looking over the last 40 years, the real income in real terms of middle-class Canadians has not gone up. All over, to your point, the absolute GDP growth is driven by a growth in population, predominantly from immigration. So as we kind of think around the way kind of forward for our country, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the answer to your question, this is now the era of big government, not just in Canada, but around the world. And part of that component of the era of big government has been a surge in national debts, both in Canada, but also in most developed countries around the world. With Canada now kind of going from kind of the top of the pack in terms of low federal debt load to now, more middle of the pack. To what extent do you view the rising Canadian federal, but also provincial and municipal debts, so public debts in general, as a significant risk to Canada's long-term labor productivity, but also economic vitality in general?
You're way too young for me to reference 1993, but I'm going to reference 1993. History has a strange way of repeating itself. Right? If you don't learn from your mistakes, you're doomed to repeat them, as the saying goes. Where we are right now is a fragile situation. Okay? When you have $350 billion worth of deficit in a country of 37.5 million people, give or take, and inflation is on the horizon, interest rates have only one place to go right now. They're going to go up, up, and up. It's going to be a run for the next year or two. It is going to create risk, right? I worry about inequality as a consequence of everything that we're talking about, right? Because inequality is what breeds resentment, and what resentment breeds is populism, and populism breeds Donald Trump, right? We have to be very careful that in this period, we're doing everything we can to address inequality and making this growth as inclusive as we can to make sure that people are getting the education that they need, they're getting the skills and the reskilling that they need, and that government is not adding to the burden of deficit and debt at this time, that they realize that this has reached a pinnacle. There is no more capacity. If any credit agency out there, credit rating agency out there, looked at our federal, provincial, and municipal debt and put it together, we would be downgraded instantly. It's only because of the federal that we're getting away with some of this stuff, right? Like, our situation is not healthy. And so we are not too far away from the risk of a downgrade of our credit rating. Why should people care? Well, the taxes that you pay is what pays for the interest on that deficit and that debt. If the interest rates rise, we now have to use more of our money, your tax money, to facilitate the offset the rising interest costs, which provide absolutely no value to you whatsoever. It's money down the toilet, right? How do we avoid that? You avoid that with growth. You bring about long-term economic growth that reduces your debt to GDP ratio, that brings down, it makes your interest costs, affordable, because you're not going to be running the risk of higher interest rates. Economic growth and all of that will allow you to offset the burden that we've now created, which we had to create. I mean, I think we spent more than we needed to, and the global analysis shows we spent more than we needed to, but we are where we are. This is the number. Now we've got to figure out how to pay it back. And I believe strongly, Scott, that the average Canadian understands this. We do not give them enough credit. They know that this is borrowed money, and they know it's borrowed from their kids and their grandkids. And they know that is grossly unfair. Right? So we've got to put the trajectory in place here that shows that that deficit can be tamed and brought down. I look back to Paul Martin and his legacy, and Prime Minister Chrétien at that time in 1993, to make difficult decisions, that we can't do everything for everyone, and that we have to, unfortunately, make some constraints. It's just like a family. Again, back to Ralph Klein, he would always compare the debt to the mortgage. You want to pay it down, right? You want to pay it down. You want to accelerate the payments. You want to put the excess cash into it. That is going to have to come with revenue increase, right? And that's not just tax grabs. I mean, I think we have to be very careful here to say, well, we'll put in taxes. Again, money is mobile and people are mobile. So all of policy evidence shows to do the populist thing actually doesn't produce the revenue generation that you need. It makes you feel good, maybe get you a few votes, but it doesn't produce any revenue. So if the goal is to produce revenue, we need to create an economic growth strategy. We have to grow our economy. And that's what we're focused on. And we think that comes from investing in people. First and foremost, let's make sure everybody in Canada who wants a job has a chance to get the job. Whether you're an immigrant with skills that aren't being recognized, whether you're a person with a disability, whether you're women who are grossly underutilized in our workforce, Indigenous community, which is 50% now below the age of 25, represent a great opportunity for them to get educated, to get a job, to get the skills and reskills. And again, this is a partnership. This is not government does everything. Let's government and business figure out, what do you do? What do I do?
Speaking of skills development, greatest asset that we really have as a country are our people. And at the same time, it is increasingly incredibly expensive for Canadians to live in cities like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. It now costs $1.5 million dollars to buy a house in Toronto or Vancouver at the minimum often. And it's increasingly untenable for a lot of young people to make their lives in these cities. And it's also increasingly challenging for new immigrants to even move to these cities and be able to make a life. So when we're speaking about debt in this country, I think it's interesting to think about debt both at a government level, but also the indebtedness of individual Canadians. And I can imagine it's probably something you hear sometimes from your members, the challenges of their employees in terms of cost of life with regards to real estate and soaring cost of mortgages, but also of rents. What do you think should be done by the federal government and provincial governments to make housing more affordable? And relatedly, what do you think are some of the negative impacts that Canada's kind of addiction to real estate has on our national economic growth?
Look, first of all, thank God for the consumer, right? Because for the longest time, the consumers kept the economic growth happening. It hasn't been much else. Unfortunately, it's created a run on house inflation, right? And that can't be matched by wage inflation. Wage inflation is happening, but not to the level at which, I think Ottawa houses are up 35% in the last 2 years. It's an absurd amount of increase there. Sometimes the answer is simple and sometimes it's complicated. So the simple answer here is supply, right? Anybody you talk to, we've got some members who are in this, and they're like, we got to increase supply. We've got to build more housing, and it's bogged up in regulations often, right? Process, assessments and reviews and appeals and all of that kind of stuff. So the consumer is suffering as a result of that, right? So we've got to address that issue. We have a charter that allows people to live wherever they want. So I'm not going to tell people where to live. It's not unnatural. I mean, there's a project underway right now where there's a deliberate attempt to bring Afghan refugees into Calgary. And we've learned that in a matter of literally weeks, if not, at most a few months, they find their way to Toronto. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? And a lot of it has to do with, birds of a feather flock together. You go to where your people are. You go to where the infrastructure is. You want the mosque or the temple or the synagogue or whatever. You feel that there's a value of being in a big city that has the infrastructure that you're going to need. Subway system, functional LRT or all those kinds of things. You want the international connectivity of the airport. Whatever the reasons are, you end up going there, and you also go there mostly because you believe that's where the job is, right? So it's possible that coming out of the pandemic, as we look at a hybrid model, which many people are now bringing in to their workplaces, as we look at the feasibility of working from home potentially, things are going to change. I don't know how this is all going to unfold, but things are going to change. And an employee now who doesn't want to come downtown doesn't have to. If this employer is forced to do it, they can say, well, I'm going to work for somebody else. And that somebody else might be a company somewhere else, right? So now you don't need to have a house in downtown Toronto anymore or near downtown Toronto. You could live in Aurora or in Richmond and get the discount on that will offer you. So I think we might see some sprawl outward in the suburbia, if you will, if not further out. What I'd like to see is the use of policy creatively done within the charter, where you're attracting people to come. I come back to economic growth again, right? Because affordability of some of these things is driven by, we've had wage inflation in the last 2 years, right? Part of it is demographics. Part of it is just the reality of people having withdrawn from work. I mean, we've lost people who retired early, women who said, I can't do this, I'm out. People who've become entrepreneurial, nothing wrong with that. I think that's fantastic, but they're not available to the workforce in the same way. And so there has been inflation, but it'll never be to the levels of what we're seeing over there.
Looping back to something we discussed at the very beginning, which is about the need for Canada to diversify. That I think the election of Donald Trump was kind of a wake-up call for many Canadians that we cannot rely on the United States in perpetuity. And even with the election of Joe Biden, there has been a continued focus on kind of Buy America. In many ways, Joe Biden doesn't say America first, but American policies still reflect that American first ethos. And not necessarily, viewing Canada in perhaps as friendly a light as it relates to trade issues. So to the point about trade diversification and kind of brand kind of Canada, what do you think Canada should be doing to diversify its interests away from the United States and become a more significant player in terms of global trade?
Governments have built the bridge. The bridge is the trade agreements, okay? Because businesses don't negotiate trade agreements, governments do. We have a trade agreement with the United States and Mexico that represents a half a billion people. We have a trade agreement with the CPTPP, which represents, I believe, another 500 million people in largely Asia, but not exclusively. The Chile and others are there. And we have a trade agreement with the European Union, CETA, which is another 500 million people. Right there is access for anybody doing business in Canada to 1.5 billion people with trade agreements that are, for the most part, honored and predictable, a little less so down south than I'd like to see, but for the most part, and if not, there are some legitimate dispute mechanisms in how you go about and resolve these issues. And you win some and you lose some. In the case of Canada, we tend to win more than we lose, which is good. It tells you that our trade negotiators, who are, I think, world-class, have done a really good job of this. Now, trade is under attack, right? Trade is now under attack. Globalization is under attack. And so countries like ours who are dependent on being trading nations need to make the case for why a WTO is important, why we need appellate court judges appointed to the WTO, why trade, honoring trade agreements is important, how trade is a force for good. We have allowed the narrative to be hijacked to some extent by the downside of everything, right? Because look, nothing's in life is neat and clean. There's always mess. There's always consequence. How do you minimize it? And how do you maximize the other side of it is a responsibility that I think political leaders and business leaders and others face. We have to have, in the case of Canada, in addition to, I don't think we actually need more trade deals per se. I mean, I'd like to see one with Indonesia and India and a few other places, but it's not imperative, right? I mean, those countries can join blocs and other things can happen, But what we need to do is defend the importance of trade. I mean, I'm going to hammer home the message I really want your audience to leave with is policy matters. And so it's one thing to say we have trade agreements, but it's another thing if we can't build the infrastructure. Where is the infrastructure to help have the arteries of being a trading economy? We're not doing that, right? So that's a critical component of this. And you need money. Canada can be an attractive destination, not just for people. It can also be an attractive destination and has been for capital.
And that ultimately investing in Canadian labor productivity and productivity in general, our economic growth, is a root driver of how we tackle issues that people care a lot about, like climate change, reconciliation, systemic racism, our aging population, healthcare challenges. The issues we face as a country are massive, but ultimately one of the main inputs of how we solve these problems is through money. We live in a world where money and financial resources are essential. And I think that that's something that I find often in chatting with people. There'll be a lot of people who care deeply about climate change. I care deeply about climate change, but it's a recognition that the way that we address climate change is through significant financial investments.
This is a very important point. I'm going to make it as clearly and as carefully as I can, because I don't want anyone to have an iota of a doubt that, businesses, certainly the people I represent, me, all of us, we are all in on climate change and what needs to be done. There's no need to convince anybody, okay? The capital is formed, the boards are there, the C-suites are there, your employees are there, your regulators there, your government is there, your community is there. It's all there. In fact, in our case, the Business Council of Canada's members were the first business organization in all of North America in 2007 to endorse carbon pricing. Now, we've been under enormous pressure by governments of different stripes to say, oh, that's the wrong way. We said, you know what? You do what you need to do. We believe this is a good policy because it's the most market-sensitive policy, right? The carbon price. The challenge has now become, when governments come out with rebates and all of these kinds of things, that people think that the cost to them is largely nil. So most people will say, I believe in climate change. It's real. And I really think government should do something about it and business should do something about it. And by the way, I support the carbon tax. I just want to make sure the rebate applies. Like I get my money back, right? I'm getting the rebate. So I'm committed, but I want my rebate. And just to show you in some cases that I'm a good sport and I understand that I've got to put some skin in the game, here's $100. Here's $100 out of my utilities budget. I'm borrowing from some dinner that I was going to take instead, but here you go, right? And I'm committed. When do we get honest with Canadians that it's not going to cost $100, right? When are we going to start talking to Canadians about the fact that we don't have an electricity grid in this country? When are we going to talk to them about, the costs of retrofitting your homes, right? I mean, governments have come out and said, like, you're no longer allowed a natural gas furnace. I got 5 things I can look at in my home right here that are running on natural gas, right? So, like, am I paying for this retrofitting? How does this work? Do we have the labor to do the work? The expectations that we have of human behavior. Like I live in Canada. I can't ride a bike to Toronto. I can't ride a bike to work half the year. Right? This is a big country. How do we have honest talk and reality check about what's done? With all due respect to governments, present and previous, you keep going to these international conferences. You keep having to show up the other guy by saying, well, I'm going to raise, I'll see your, pair and raise you or whatever it is. And we keep extending targets. Like it's up to 45% now when we've successfully reduced 1% in the last decade or so, right? We got a long ways to go to get to that. We need to do it. We have to work in partnership to do it. It's going to cost a hell of a lot of money to do it, right? And we have to be honest with Canadians that they're going to have some skin in this game too.
And Canadian companies, to your point, are leaders. Both the Business Council in 2007, TD Bank is the first carbon neutral bank in North America, and many other organizations that have really.
I got a long list, and it's on our website. I encourage people to go to businesscouncil.ca, have a look at the website to learn about what these organizations and entities are doing. Look, I'm not a novice in politics. I understand how this game works, and I get the media. Safe landings don't get reported, right? But there's a lot of good things happening out there that we need to have a way, and podcasts like this and the one I host are a part of telling Canadians there are good things happening, right? But we need to be honest with people throughout this process, because otherwise I think you run the risk of what we're seeing of happening in different parts of the world.
And happiness equals reality minus expectations. And I think for a lot of people, as we think around the energy transition, it's to your point, recognizing there's going to be a lot of sacrifices. I think 2021 and some of the challenges globally with different energy systems and trying to make this transition, and the fact power outages and it's going to be a messy process. It's not necessarily going to be smooth. So Goldy, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I really want to underline the importance of Canadian economic growth is a root driver of how we address so many different challenges in our society, and business plays a really important role. I highly recommend our listeners check out businesscouncil.ca and Goldy's podcast, Speaking of Business. Goldy, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Scott. But more importantly, thank you for what you do. As I said, it's having the opportunity to speak with Canadians the way you make it possible. That's going to help get us where we need to go.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.